red meat has made it back into the headlines again. You know, it got to do its rounds, just like eggs and coffee. You know the deal. So, here we are again. Red meat. 1 minute, got to get your iron and B12 from the red meat. Next minute, your red meat is equivalent to cigarettes. So, what is it? What are we doing? So if you're trying to feed your family and stay healthy, I know all this noise could be confusing and exhausting. But guess what? There's a little secret that ain't so much a secret. Science isn't actually as confused as the headlines make it, right? The problem isn't the research, it's how the research gets translated or mistranslated, and then it turns into this like fear-based headlines, and then it strips away all the context. So today we're going to step into some real talk and out of the fear-mongering and into the nuance, right? We're going to break down what the science actually says about the red meat, how it pertains to breast cancer, and why your cooking method matters more than the meat itself, and how to navigate this. We're going to do it through a cultural lens, because we got to respect our traditions, people. Because, in our communities, food, yes, it is definitely fuel, but it's also family and it's culture. And understanding the science allows us to make those choices that's going to support our health without the unnecessary anxiety. Hey, beautiful people, welcome back to Well with Mika, where we talk real wellness for your real life. I'm Mika, your cultural wellness ally, and today we're going to talk about red meat, breast cancer, and why context is everything. Okay, let's get into it. First, let's get our terms straight, right? When we're talking about red meat, right, usually scientists, they're talking about mammalian muscle, right? The beef, the pork, the lamb, the goat, the venison is dark because of myoglobin, right? A protein that carries oxygen to the muscles. But here's where the conversation usually fails. When the headlines come out about red meat consumption, what's happening is unprocessed steak and ground beef gets lumped into the same category as the processed hot dogs and bacon. And that's a huge mistake because they're two different things, okay? Because the strongest evidence for health risks, so specifically when it comes to colorectal cancer, is tied to processed meats. Now, back in 2015, the World Health Organization, reviewed hundreds of studies and classified processed meats as group 1 carcinogens, right? Now, that sounds terrifying. I'm like, hey, group 1, you too high up in that group for me. I don't want no parts of you. But when the headlines ran with it, they said, oh, bacon is as dangerous as cigarettes. But we have to really think about that because there's some nuance that the headlines rarely discuss because it just don't sound as good to go into the nuance, to be honest. It just doesn't. That classification of group 1 carcinogen, it reflects the strength of the evidence, not the size of the risk. I'm going to say it again. The classification reflects the strength of the evidence, not the size of the risk. So eating a hot dog is not as dangerous as smoking a pack of cigarettes, but the evidence that processed meat can cause harm, particularly colorectal cancer, is just as clear. Unprocessed red meat, on the other hand, was placed in a different category, which is probably carcinogenic. And even in that category, the actual increased risk associated with moderate consumption is kind of small, especially compared to major lifestyle risks like smoking, obesity, or heavy alcohol use. So when we think about it, we really got to put it into context. I know it could be overwhelming and sound confusing, so that's why I really want to state that, because you don't want to go into it thinking, oh my gosh, I had a hot dog yesterday, I'm going to die. No, that's not how it works. You didn't just increase your risk by 60%. It is a minimal increase. Now, I'm not advocating to eat the processed meats. By no means am I doing that. I'm just saying that the associated risk, the grouping of being a group 1 carcinogenic issue, they mean different things than what the headlines might say or how you might interpret it, okay? So now let's talk about the question women over 35 especially are concerned about, and that is breast cancer. Research looking at red meat and breast cancer has produced some mixed results. Some large observational studies, they found that women who consume like really high amounts of red meat, particularly during early adulthood, they may have a slightly higher risk. But many other studies show little or no significant association. So when researchers they start combining the studies together, that's called a meta-analysis. And the typical risk increase is around 10 to 20% relative risk. So now what does that mean like in real life? That means, let's say your baseline risk of breast cancer is around 12% over your lifetime, right? A 10 to 20% relative increase brings that to about 13 to 14%. So it's not a huge jump. That's a small absolute difference, right? So just keep that in mind. Now, of course you want to minimize the amount of risk that you add to your, to getting breast cancer. So I'm just saying keep that in mind and don't beat yourself up, okay? And the key is red meat is not considered a major driver of breast cancer risk. So if red meat isn't the major driver, what is, right? The science is actually pretty clear because in some global research, it suggests that about a quarter of the healthy years lost to breast cancer worldwide are linked to modifiable lifestyle factors. Now, this is what the article that I read that prompted this whole episode was discussing. But what they did was it seemed to inflate the impact of red meat, right? Because when we're talking about modifiable lifestyle factors, we're dealing with obesity or high body weight, especially after menopause. We're dealing with alcohol consumption. It feels like people don't really want to talk about the alcohol consumption part of it, but maybe that's just me. But smoking, exposure, physical inactivity, high blood sugar, and insulin resistance. Those are all modifiable lifestyle factors. And what's important to understand is that when researchers look at big groups of people who eat a lot of red meat, they often notice a pattern. High red meat intake often goes hand in hand with low fiber intake, more alcohol consumption, less physical activity, higher rates of smoking. So that's called confounding, when meaning, things along with, right? Confounding. When researchers adjust for those factors and they account for obesity, alcohol, the inactivity, the link between red meat and disease often it shrinks, or sometimes in some cases it disappears. So what's the real story? The real story is your metabolic health, things like your blood sugar, your weight, and how your body handles insulin. Those are much bigger players in breast cancer risk than a lean steak. Now you heard me, I said a lean steak. And now there's another part that gets really, really interesting, because one aspect that does matter a lot when we're dealing with red meat, and actually a lot of our foods, is how it's cooked. When meat is cooked at extremely high temperatures, especially over an open flame, like, when you're grilling and stuff, certain compounds can form, including your heterocyclic amines. Look, I don't like pronouncing any of these, so I will just say HCAs. Your polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, those are PAHs, right? And these chemicals, they can damage your DNA. That's what's shown in lab experiments, right? So frequent consumption of heavily charred meat, that can slightly increase your cancer risk. So sometimes we don't discuss that. Heavily charred meats can increase your cancer risk. And guess what? That doesn't just apply to the meats, even though I believe the amount in the meats are higher. But when you bun up your toast, that actually does the same thing. So, just consider those things. And then there's a cultural advantage to this, because if you think about how we often cook in our communities, the slow simmered stews, that's what I was used to eating, right? We usually lean towards things like stew peas, or you get your braised oxtail, you get the pots that cook low and slow for hours, right? So, and I'm not saying that's how everyone cooks, but I'm just saying, consider that you might be doing things right. So you might not have to take out all the red meat. You don't want to overdo it, but you really want to pay attention to how you're cooking it, because the gentle cooking methods produce much lower levels of the harmful compounds, right? So you're stewing, you're slow cooking, you're roasting, you're baking. You look, our ancestors, they were doing something right, okay? And if you do grill, the pro tip based on science is to marinate your meat in something citrusy, or garlic or herbs. Marinate first, right? Because the research is showing that when you marinate, a simple marinade, it could block up to 90% of those harmful chemicals. So see, marinate your meats, people. Marinate. You can have your meat and your health too, okay? It's all in the simmer, okay? Now, let's talk about what often gets overlooked in the conversation, and that is red meat is actually nutritionally dense, right? I mean, it gets talked about, but it also gets demonized a lot. It does provide important nutrients that many women, particularly women over 35, they need. The heme iron, the kind that your body actually absorbs, the vitamin B12 for your brain and energy, the zinc for your immune system. It's high quality protein. Iron deficiency, fatigue, and low B12 levels are actually quite common in women, right? Particularly those who are still having heavy menstruals or limited animal food intake. So if you really cut all your red meat out entirely, because of like some scary headline, not because it's like a dietary choice that you wanted to make in terms of, being vegan or vegetarian. You might just be trading one problem for another. So just be mindful of it. The goal isn't necessarily to tell you to eliminate red meat. It's to think about the quality, the preparation, balance, You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to be freaking taking the meat to hell to cook it. You want to be balanced. You want to marinate it. You want to have not too much. You get the idea. So what does this mean for us in practical terms? So based on what the evidence is showing, and if you're really trying to, be mindful and keep incorporating the meats and be, whatever, if your traditions say, look, this is what we eat and I ain't gonna stop eating it, then hey, more power to you. I just want you to focus on unprocessed lean cuts, the sirloin, the tenderloin, the grass-fed when possible. Save the processed meats, bacon, sausage, the deli meats. Save those for the one-offs, the special occasions, the times when you can't get access to anything else. But the one-offs. Every other day is not a one-off, okay? Now, stop, okay? Then change the heat. Swap the char for a stew. Stew your meats. If you do grill, just marinate that joint first, okay? Marinate it first. We talked about it. The citrus, the garlic, the herbs. They not only do they gonna make it taste bomb, but they create that protective barrier, right? And then the plate mate rule. We're gonna never let the meat travel alone in your guts, okay? You gotta pair that meat with the fiber. Your parents didn't tell you eat your greens first. Eat your greens, your beans, your grains, eat them first, okay? Put that first up in your system before you eat that meat, all right? Fiber is your biological bodyguard, man. It's going to mop up that potential stress that the meat might cause, okay? You want to aim for about 3 to 4 servings per week of your meat if you're going to do it. You could do less if you want, but you don't really want to go over 3 to 4 servings. So that's kind of the sweet spot where you could get the B12, the zinc benefits without hitting the high risk curve. So about 12 to 16 ounces total in a week of unprocessed lean red meat. And that should be good for you based on what the science has been saying over the years. This is not just some new headline. If you really look at what they've been saying over the years, that's what it all boils down to. Red meat, it is one of the most nutrient-dense foods. It's not really a villain. It's just another tool, another thing to put on the plate. So the truth isn't about total avoidance. It's really context, it's context. It's context, it's cooking, it's all of that. And at the end of the day, I don't want your wellness to be based in fear. We got to get out of that. It's about your informed choices and being balanced. Because, our food is deeply connected to, our culture, our family, our community, the nourishment. And understanding the science does allow us to make choices that support our health. But we don't want to go crazy over it, So I hope this helped you feel less overwhelmed. If it did, please hit the like button, subscribe, share if you're here for thoughtful, evidence-based conversations about health. Okay, and if you want to know what else the research is actually saying is a bigger threat than health, to your health than the beef, please, put it in the comment section, all right? And let me know what else you want to talk about on the channel, all right? We can dive into it. Please take care of yourselves and keep choosing wellness, real wellness. As always, happy healthing. Peace.